So when we step in, we're becoming a partner with these doctors, and I'm a big believer in the concept: if it's not broken, don't go fix it just for the sake of changing. And so if it's working for them, then great. And a lot of practices, there's different providers that are in different phases of life and have different goals.
Let's get you paid. A senior REI wrote in with this question. One of your peers wrote in with this question, asking me to interview a CEO on this topic, and I do what you say. So you, the listening audience, when you want to know something deeper about a particular subject matter, let me know. I'll try to find someone who will speak on it, and I'll grill them with a bunch of questions. This topic had to do with the pros and cons of different compensation models for fertility physicians. So I brought on a CEO. I brought back TJ Farnsworth. You know him as the CEO of Inception Fertility, and because he's been on Inside Reproductive Health many times. TJ talks about the two main sides of compensation: guaranteed income and variable compensation. Within variable compensation, you have it tied to individual performance, tied to practice performance. Within those different performance camps, you have different figures to which you can tie those performance metrics, by which I mean to say you can tie them to KPIs like retrievals, transfers, or you can tie them to a percentage of collections. TJ talks about the problems with tying them to KPIs, such as who actually performed the surgery. Was it the doctor of record? Is the EMR reliable? Did the person checking in the person check them in with one doctor, but was actually a different doctor of record? Is the accounting system getting the right information? TJ prefers to keep it simple. He talks about some of the mistakes that Inception Fertility made in doing KPI-based compensation and why he likes variable comp as a percentage of collections. He also talks about what that variable comp doesn't solve for and why physician ownership is so important in calibrating the incentives. That's physician ownership in the practice. We talk about profit sharing. We talk about when it does make sense to have guaranteed income only. And we talk about the division of labor outside of productivity roles, when you have an administrator role, a medical director role. I pressed TJ a little bit when we were talking about the incentives of 5 to 7 doctor practices. I seem to think they're harder to align than he does. Not totally sure I got on his page about that question, but TJ really did thoroughly answer that senior doc's question. And that was the whole origin of this topic. You might have other thoughts on compensation. You might point out questions I didn't ask. So email me them, tell me what they are, give me more topics and questions so we can continue to build valuable content. Mr. Farnsworth, welcome back yet again to Inside Reproductive Health, TJ.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to be on here with you. I was thinking about this before we got on. You're the only guy in the fertility industry whose hair I'm jealous of.
Well, right now it's looking pretty similar. You know, the vast majority of people listen to the audio. They don't watch it on YouTube. But right now, both TJ and my hair are doing what it wants. But I think this is probably the 4th or 5th time that you've been on the show. I always enjoy having you on. And I like the fact that you came on to talk about a topic that an audience member asked for. So to give the audience context, this was a senior REI who wanted to know about compensation models. Now, this person has exited their practice, I think is practicing again as an employee somewhere. So perhaps this is why this person asked, but they asked, would you bring a CEO on to talk about the pros and cons of different compensation models? And I said, I know a guy. And so I think the people like you, TJ, deserve credit because some people would say, oh, I don't know. I don't want to say the wrong thing. It's like the people are asking for this. Come on, try to be generous with some darn information. And so,
well, and there's not a right or wrong thing, right? So it's there's 100 different ways to skin this, and I feel certain there's only one truth to this. There's not a right or wrong answer to this question. There's just different ones.
So let's try to lie out all of the ways that one can skin this cat. Like, give us just an intro to the different compensation models that exist, and then we'll start to explore them.
Yeah, so I think all compensation models have one or more of a few components. One of which is potentially some type of a guaranteed income, whether it be in the form of a base salary or a guarantee on variable comp, some type of a variable comp program tied to a provider's individual personal performance, then potentially some type of a variable comp program that's tied to a practice performance, which could include or be in addition to an ownership model that includes profit distributions. And so, I think those are, and there are various different ways to do each one of those components. And some comp models will include all of them, and some will include just certain specific components of it.
Is it rare nowadays to see any model that doesn't have any variable comp, or is there still some of that maybe in the academic sphere?
Probably in the academic sphere, we have we're a little bit unique in that we do operate an academic fertility clinic, and in those we do have variable comp structures in place. But so I would think the majority of them are going to have some type of variable comp, because even in major hospital systems and academic centers outside of fertility, that they're measuring productivity of physicians, whether it be on an RVU basis or collections basis or some other way. So I would be willing to bet that that almost everyone has some type of a variable compensation flavor to it in some way. And but there are some models like that. In our operation, and I'd be happy to talk about even specifics around how we do it at Inception. There should be nothing that's considered a secret here. And we have some practices that may not have an individual productivity component to it, but they have a ownership structure that allows for profit sharing. So obviously, as the practice grows, that they'll allow for that. And I think it's important that we also consider not only the quantitative aspects of things, but also the qualitative, because what is the right or wrong answer, as we were saying earlier, might be right for one practice, but the culture of another practice, a different model might work better. Usually, even within Inception, for example, we don't have one compensation model we use across the U.S. and Canada. We have what works in one market. Each individual practice has some of their own personality to it. And so it works for that practice from that personality. And some of them have some of their own, like, just practical differences in terms of the size and scale. And you've got some of the larger practices where physicians are specializing. And so it dictates a need for flexibility. But I think ultimately, those foundational variables in terms of how you're getting compensation are always part of the equation, no matter which recipe you're going to combine those with.
Walk us through two different scenarios, because then I want to explore that qualitative difference between those. But walk us through two different scenarios of two different practices that have different compensation models.
Two wide examples. So in certain scenarios, you have what I'll refer to as eat what you treat models, where there is no fixed base compensation; it's all variable. So unlimited upside, unlimited downside kind of structures to them. And those work in certain communities and certain environments. And in all cases, at least with us, 100% of cases with us, all of our physicians are either partners with us in the practices or on a pathway to partnership. So either they're already partner or they're on our way to partnership. And so in 100% of cases, at least for us, everybody either does or will have some level of stake in the overall profitability of the business. So in that scenario where it's an eat what you treat model, that eat what you treat concept would be tied to their own individual personal productivity. And then obviously the ownership share would take into account the overall profitability of the whole enterprise. And then we have models where there is some level of base compensation. And I think this is a more common model, where you've got some level of base compensation, either in the form of a guaranteed minimum bonus or in the form of a salary. And you've got a individual personal productivity component on top of that. And then in addition to that, either they're either them already having or on their way to having a share in the overall ownership of the practice. So it gives them the base salary, which I think most physicians, at least starting out, want, so they have some level of predictability around their income. And then you've got the variable compensation that ties to their own personal productivity, and then you have the ownership component that would tie to the overall profitability of their practice.
So let's talk a little bit about the qualitative that makes one model a fit for one group and not another. What is it about practice that has it's all eat what you treat? It's all variable with the unlimited upside and the unlimited downside. What makes it a good fit for them that wouldn't necessarily be a good fit for someone else?
Yeah. So a lot of it is history. So a lot of it is just the sort of the culture that's built there. So when we step in, we're becoming a partner with these doctors, and I'm a big believer in the concept: if it's not broken, don't go fix it just for the sake of changing. And so if it's working for them, then great. And a lot of practices, there's different providers that are in different phases of life and have different goals, right? So any what you treat model allows that physician who's more interested in a certain lifestyle to make less, but balance that with more time for themselves and for family and time outside of work, without at the same time generating any animosity with the physician who is in the phase of their life where they want to maximize their productivity and thereby maximize their income. And so it allows for that diversity of things. I think, though, we see that model less and less often, but certainly it's a model we use in several different practices. And then, the other side of things is you've got practices where, which I think is a more common model, where you have, 5, 6, 7 physicians that are all aligned, all sort of were recruited, and built a culture around sort of a similar level of productivity and a similar lifestyle goals. They're on that sort of base with some type of an individual personal productivity, and then obviously a substantial component tied to the overall profitability of the practice. And then I'll introduce a third one for you. We have a scenario where we have a very large practice with 20 plus REIs that has no variable compensation tied to the individual doctor's productivity. And so everyone makes the same in terms of base, and then they have their ownership of the practice. And the reason that practice does that is that they've gotten so large that there's specializing happening. And so whether that's specializing in certain regions of a market or specializing in certain aspects of clinical care, where there may be somebody who is clinically passionate about certain things, but that's higher. That doesn't generate as much from a revenue perspective. But it's really important to the practice to have that component, and it's really important to the group to maybe be in a certain region or geography, and they don't want to penalize somebody for pursuing that goal. And so the idea being that everyone is contributing to the overall benefit, and so their variable comp, so to speak, comes from the overall profitability of the business. So, rather than everyone rowing the boat in the direction of their own personal productivity, they're all rowing the boat in the direction of the overall profitability of the enterprise. So,
in that case, so the third example you used with no variable comp outside of the profit sharing, and that was a 20 plus doc group. Does that model only work in a group that size or larger, in your view?
I think that certainly it's got to be a big group in order for it to make sense. And part of the reason why that group does that is that as they expand into new markets, as they expand into new regions, there's not, if they had a scenario where a physician was, half their compensation was based upon their personal productivity, none of the doctors would ever agree to go out there and set up that new office and start anew. And so they developed this culture where whether it was expanding to a new geography or somebody who is going to focus on fertility preservation in its early days, where there might not be as much business for that yet until that practice is built, it was overall important for them to be building those aspects of the business, whether it be geography or that aspect of clinical care, and knowing that they didn't want to penalize somebody for going and pioneering that new business line or that new office, and so they developed this model to do that with. And so I do think that it's unique that you need a practice that's got a certain level of scale to get to a place where that's necessary. But they started with a variable compensation structure. They migrated to that over time.
Are all the salaries the same, or does that vary depend on seniority?
Nope, salaries are all the same.
So then how does profit sharing work in a model like that? If I would direct listeners to a book called Great Game of Business, which started off in the manufacturing sphere, but lays out an interesting model for profit sharing. And the way profit sharing works in the Great Game of Business model is that people get bonused a percentage of their salary. So profit sharing is different from the person that might be everyone in the company shares in the profit, but it's the person that's a greeter making minimum wage gets a percentage of what they make. And then the senior executives that are leading their divisions get a higher percentage because it's a percentage of their salary. And so how does profit sharing work in a model where everybody has the same salary?
Yeah, so I think I'm using the term profit sharing really as a placeholder because in different markets, there's different states, there's different rules, different laws around how physicians can be owners in a practice. And so in most cases, our physicians are just owners. And so they are taking profit share by virtue of the fact that they own a percentage of the practice. If they own whatever that percentage might be, if they own 10% of the practice and the practice, generated $100 profit, they're getting $10. And so, in certain areas, we aren't able to do that because of the regulatory structure in that market. So you just use contractual profit shares. You can give voting rights and all those types of things that come with traditional ownership too.
And so in that example of 20 plus docs, not every doc owns the same percentage of the company. Is that correct? Some own
some of the more senior doctors own a little bit more, but it's not as big of a disparity as you might think. And over time, their model is that, generally speaking, as a rule, is in the event that we do have what I would refer to as more senior partners with more ownership, you want to migrate them to an equal ownership model. Creating multiple classes of ownership is really, not good for the culture from our perspective.
Really, we're talking about owner's distribution in this case. I should clarify that the profit sharing outlined in Great Game of Business is for the entire company. So even if you have 1,000 people, and it kicks in after a certain net profit target.
Threshold, yeah.
So, if it's under X% net profit, then nobody shares in that bonus, and it's phased so that people can make it up in different parts of the quarter. But the whole idea is that everybody in the company knows what the target is, and they're all going for that. Are you familiar with that? Do you use that model anywhere where everyone in the company or everyone in the practice can share in the profit after a certain amount?
We have practice-wide bonus structures in place in various different markets, but we don't have company-wide profit sharing plans in the way in which you're referring to it. That's common in some industries.
Perhaps it's because of the regulation that you were hinting at, but I wonder sometimes why don't some practices just do profit sharing with their partner docs as opposed to actually making them part owners of the business? What would be the con to doing that?
There really isn't any pro or con. There's some scenarios in some areas where there's tax advantages. So I think that probably the biggest driver is tax advantages to it. But I think generally speaking, physicians from emotional reasons want actual ownership rather than profit share, even though we can design and construct profit shares to look and behave exactly the same way as traditional equity does. And our preference usually is just to do traditional equity. It's simpler. It's usually more tax efficient, but it's oftentimes dictated by the regulatory rules around the corporate practice of medicine or statewide referral laws that might exist in any given market.
Have you come across any funky state laws off the top of your head that you can remember that, it's harder in this state, or people have to watch out for this in this state?
No, I mean, there's states that are more complicated, but the reality is that the joint venturing.
Do those complicated states rhyme with California and New York, or is it not always the usual suspects?
it's not always the usual suspects. You might be surprised. Those certainly are complicated states, but even the state of Texas, which you would think of as land of the free market, is one of the more complicated states. And so it's not quite that straightforward. But I would say that in all those markets and all those states, there have been structures in place and have been in place for a long time to accommodate for physician ownership. And it's just like any regulatory environment. There's some group of attorneys that have constructed a very above board and transparent and clean way of doing it that generates them some fees. So,
tell us more about the difference between variable comp tied to individual performance versus when it's tied to practice performance.
Yeah, so we don't see the what I'll call just sort of traditional comp that's tied to practice-wide performance very often. We do have it in a couple of cases in our clinics, only because it existed before we were there. We prefer that we as a company, I think most are this way as well. Would prefer that the way in which you participate in practice-wide performance and improvement is through profitability, because that I'm a huge believer in aligned incentives. And so if my incentives are the exact same as yours, it helps build trust. It helps build confidence in the decisions that we're all making. We all win and lose together. That's really, it's got a lot of value. So that's the way we lean on the practice-wide comp structure, a variable comp structure. On the personal comp structure, there really are, I think, two main models. One of which is tying productivity bonus to certain KPIs, whether it be retrievals or I think retrieval being the most common. The other model, which I think is what we prefer, and which is something tied to a percentage of overall collections of productivity from that individual physician. That way, you're not tying it to some sort of clinical activity. I think certainly the intent of the bonus per VOR concept was likely never to try and drive some type of a clinical behavior, because obviously we trust all of our physicians to make the right clinical decisions. That's their specialty. But obviously, to do a certain number of VORs, you have to get through so much diagnostics and so many IUIs, and there's sort of some mix of all that in there. But I do think that as you're moving more and more towards more managed care coverage for services, whether it be Progeny or Kindbody or traditional Aetna, United, otherwise, you as well as you see, generally speaking, an environment where you've got some physicians that like doing more surgical cases. You've got some physicians who like doing more fertility preservation in their practice. Whatever it is, a variable comp that's tied to just collections, allows for there not to be any environment where you're encouraging one behavior or another. And that's where we are moving to as a company. I think a lot of people within the industry are. That's not to say we don't have several practices that still operate off of what I call a KPI-based model, where they're using VORs or IUIs or transfers or some other metric or combination thereof. But it gets complicated, and I'm a sales guy at heart, and I'm a big believer in people's compensation program should follow the KISS strategy. Just let's keep it simple and make it easy for everybody, so that there's no complicated math to be done at the end of the month or the quarter. So
I started my career in radio ad sales. It was my first job out of college, which, for anybody that's not familiar with that, here's the phone book, kid. It's 100% commission. There's no training. It's like, you're a 21-year-old kid. Great. Go figure out a way to have this 57-year-old business owner who's been doing great in business for 30 years give our company money. Surely also had someone at our company who had burned that person in the past, and it was 100% commission. I learned a lot from that. But the keep it simple was, that's what worked for me. It's okay. If you want to sell more of this, tell me what the commission on it is. And, but it sounds like, just percentage of collections is a little bit different. So in my case, it was if you got this much new direct business, it was this percentage. If you could sell this much of our new online revenue stream, this much of our event revenue stream, different commissions. Is there that within that the percentage of collections, or does percentage of collections just tend to be flat because otherwise you'd be back in that KPI model?
It tends to be flat. Otherwise, you're really back to a KPI model that's just not fixed dollars. The percentage of collections tend to be, maybe there's a sliding scale involved, but in terms of thresholds of dollars of collections, but it's still just all dollars. Not, I just think it's from my perspective, it's adding a level of complexity to the model that, again, I'm all about aligned incentives and trust. And if you don't if I have to get out a spreadsheet to show you how the calculation was done, and you take 45 minutes an hour of your time every month or every quarter to make sure the numbers tie out like you think they should, it's more administrative headache. And the fastest way we can burn out and frustrate our clinicians, which obviously include our physicians and providers of all kind, then is administrative BS. And so we prefer not to add another piece of that to the table.
Aligning incentives makes sense, but what's complicated about where does the administrative headache come from? It seems straightforward, number of retrievals or number of transfers or whatever. What complicates it?
Yeah, so it's who performed the retrieval versus who was the doctor of record, making sure you can pull that out of the EMR consistently and reliably. And accounting is doing that from Nashville. And does that actually align with what happened in the practice? Because just because somebody at the front desk checked them in for retrieval under Dr. Smith when Dr. Jones was the doctor of record, that has an economic impact to that physician. It seems simpler than it is from a practical application perspective, and it's not overly complicated. Look, we do it, but it's just simpler to go. You had $100 in collections, you get this percentage of it, and it's black and white.
So doesn't that makes sense why you'd be moving toward that as a company? But doesn't some of that appear in the collections? That if it was the doctor of record versus the visiting doc, how is it more clearly attributed with collections?
Yeah, because on claims data, when you submit claims information, it's much cleaner that way versus pulling it out of the EMR has a lot of impact on who's just charting it and otherwise. And look, ultimately, you're solving for the same thing. A certain number of these KPIs all add up to a certain on a blended basis, all add up to a certain dollar amount. You're solving for the same thing. It's just how you get to that solution.
You said something earlier when we were talking where we were talking about the different models, the blend of guaranteed income and variable comp. You've got some that are almost all guaranteed income, and then you've got some that are all variable comp, and then you've got the blend. And you mentioned, sometimes you'll have a 5, 6, 7 physician practice where they've got similar productivity, they've got similar lifestyle goals. And I was thinking, TJ, I've been under the hood of a lot of 5 to 7 doctor practices, and they never are aligned on productivity and lifestyle goals. There's always 1 or 2 workhorses that are a little bit grumpy, that they're doing a lot more volume, or they just, they'd like their partners to pick up the pace, or and that's where a lot of the things that you come into, like, was it actually my patient? Were they using my nurse, et cetera, come into play. And so how do you align a group like that?
Yeah, I think that goes to not having the base comp be, all that substantial from a I mean, it's obviously an important component, and certainly as a physician starting out, they're fresh out of fellowship, that's a more important component. The long term, the variable and the ownership components, I think are always going to better align everyone's incentives, and not just when I say better aligned incentives, I'm not just talking about Inception and the physician. I'm talking about physician and physician. I mean, a lot of times physicians are concerned about how does this affect my relationship with Inception, and who's got what incentives. And a lot of times, to your point, it's not us they have to worry about. It's amongst the doctors. And I think it's mostly acute when you've got some generational differences where you have some physicians that maybe are in the middle of their career that kids are gone, and then they got some younger physicians that maybe have young children and want to be there for certain things. And I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and certainly it pains me sometimes when I'm on the road traveling and there's a school play, and I understand the desire to be there for those things, and so it's always a balance, and it's never a perfect world, but I think trying to get to a place where you've got as much aligned incentives as possible, so that the physician who is interested in a different lifestyle than another, but they're both equally interested in the overall profitability of the practice. Maybe one person's able to do one component of the business, maybe somebody's able to do cover the lab more often and do more retrievals earlier in the morning, so they can be done later in the day. There can be a little bit more of a division of labor that occurs, so that I could take some workload off you, so that you can accommodate some component of my career. That alignment of incentive allows for that. And then for the guy who wants to, or gal who wants to just, work 7 days a week, 12-hour days, having a component that allows for them to be rewarded for that makes sense. And so we try and have a combination structure that allows for there to be as little animosity as possible developed from those varying different places. But I will also say that, aside from those generational differences, most of our practices tend to recruit like-minded physicians. So, whether it be somebody whose kids are gone, they're empathetic to the physician who's got a third grader that, hey, I was that place one time in my career, and people were empathetic with me, and I'm gonna help them at this stage in their career. And so those are those sort of those qualitative differences that exist from what I call practice personality perspective that I think are important when you're evaluating whatever this comp structure is.
I see the generational side go both ways sometimes. On one side, you might have someone whose kids are out of the house and they're ready to work because it's that golf for their spouse, and so they'll go to work, and sometimes you'll have physicians with younger kids that need more time with the family. But I see a lot of young docs who they go home, they kiss their kids goodnight, and then they go right back to work.
That's absolutely right. I was just using that as one example.
And then there's a lot of docs closer, who are a little bit older that say, "Man, you're traveling the whole globe. You're going everywhere." And
and I want to play more golf or whatever. Yeah, totally. There's no question it goes both ways, and I don't mean to say that the one whose kids are gone is always more productive. That's not the case at all. We absolutely have lots of young physicians who are just absolutely focused on the greater degree of productivity. It's really just, there's not one right or wrong answer, right? Like I completely understand why. I mean, I'm a workaholic with a 7 and a 9-year-old, so I totally understand. But that person is sacrificing something, and there should be a reward at the end of that for that. And I totally also understand. My wife just retired earlier this year after 20 years, and because she both of us wanted her to have more time with the kids. So there's not, neither one of those are right or wrong.
You brought up something else that begged another question about the division of labor of things that are outside of productivity, different administrative roles. If someone is part of, they are part of a committee that makes marketing decisions, or if
or someone could take more call. I mean, there's all kinds of things.
But what about those types of things that the practice needs to run, but maybe they have an administrative role, maybe they're the medical director, maybe they're running a fellowship program if you've added that on, but they're not aligned with productivity. How do you align incentives, or how do you account for that? Because they're still contributing to the overall group, but they're not their collections aren't as high.
Yeah, and that's why the ownership component is so important, right? That aligns everyone perfectly, because and then all of those other things that you're doing that help the overall practice on a more global basis, you see that benefit yourself, and the rest of the group sees that benefit of that work you're doing and is appreciative of that.
Does it still tie in? Because if we're all sharing at the overall level, but you're able to see more folks because you're getting a higher percentage of collections, but I have to do this, it still seems like person A is winning out.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's not perfect scenario, right? So there's no one perfect answer, and so you got to look at individual situations and say, okay, maybe there's something you need to change here. There's all these sort of guidelines and rules, and they're all made to be broken so that you can make the right structure for that one group. But some groups might say to themselves, "Hey, this doctor is going to do." Going back to that practice I mentioned that it has no individual variable comp. It's because, hey, this individual doctor is going to do more of this one thing that may generate less individual collections, but it helps the overall practice, and that's why there's certainly a more common structure in our world where a small component of things or smaller component of things is tied to their individual variable per personal productivity, but still a lot of their comp is tied to the overall profitability of the enterprise. Because obviously their individual personal productivity and everyone's individual personal productivity impacts the overall productivity of the practice too. So all this is tied together. It's as you pull one lever up and down, it impacts the other levers.
How does overhead play into all of this?
Well, I think that's why the ownership component is so important, because when physicians have ownership, they're all of a sudden just as interested in all we are in being efficient with our use of overhead costs. And when I say that efficient, I don't mean as low cost as possible. That's there certainly are operators in the market that sort of focus on low cost. And there's certainly a market segment for that and a component for that. And that's fantastic. They're meeting the needs for patients in that segment. That's not our model. So, we are, but at the same time, you're always trying to be cognizant of not spending more than you need to, because, all that ultimately has to get passed on to the patient in terms of higher costs of services. And so, or lower profitability for the owners. And so, so I think it's important that it helps to align the incentives. Okay, we're going to go expand and build a new satellite office and invest in that, and that's going to reduce our profitability for a little while, but at the same time, it's going to long term grow our profitability, and it starts to get everyone thinking a longer term time horizon versus just what are my collections next quarter. And it really gets us more aligned in terms of what the strategic goals are for that practice.
So the two balance each other out. The collections gets them thinking about what they're doing in the present, but the ownership accounts for all of the things that collections might not account for, or you simply sometimes need to counterbalance both things. Like if I had an employee satisfaction score only, it's like, well, that could come at the cost of just letting my employees do whatever the heck they want and not having any accountability to the business or not having any accountability to the customers. So you might want 2 or 3, and this sounds like 2. You have ownership and you have individual bonuses on or individual comps somewhat tied to collections. So how do then how do you make some of these decisions involving partners? Some decisions are going to be made at the executive level, some you involve them more. How does that work if someone says, well, I think this is wasteful, I think we're wasting money on this supply that we could get from a cheaper place? How do you make those kind of decisions?
Yeah, I think it depends on the individual decision. I mean, clinical decisions, we obviously rely entirely on the physicians. When it comes to business things, some of which we make on an individual practice basis, we discuss it as a group and make a decision together. Some of which has to be made on an enterprise basis. I mean, we wouldn't choose different accounting systems for different practices, for example. That just doesn't make practical sense. We uniform health benefits, right? We buy Inception is 2,600 employees now in the U.S. and Canada, and we buy health insurance for everybody at once, right? So we're not sitting down with the practice individually and going, here are our options between United and Cigna, and that decision is being made globally. But that alignment of incentives builds the trust to know that we're making the right decision because it impacts us all equally. I'm not going to, we're not going to make a short-term decision and have terrible employee benefits that ends up in bad employee satisfaction, so that we have high turnover just to benefit the bottom line. But we're also not going to go out and purposefully pick the highest benefit choice for no reason.
I thought of another question that I want to make sure I ask you before we're done. But to clarify, going back to the way that collections is tied to comp, that it's not collections minus overhead. It's just
no off the top. Otherwise, everyone starts to wonder what that overhead means. I mean, the collections minus overhead is their ownership component. That's that piece of it.
Tell us about the difference in equity at the practice level, equity in the parent company level, and how each of those can work.
Yeah, I mean, the equity in the practice level, the physicians and everyone that participates in that can see, hey, I do X and it impacts Y, right? I mean, ownership in the inception level, it's any individual activity is diluted by the scale of the business, right? So it's hard to see how your individual participation impacts the overall whole. In addition, our practices all make profit distributions on a monthly or quarterly basis. Inception doesn't do that. Inception reinvests its earnings in growth, and so the only time that physicians would participate in the profitability or their ownership at the inception level is at a liquidity event, which obviously has got a lot of benefits to those physicians. But all so there's not like one is not necessarily right or wrong. It's just they just have different positives and negatives versus the monthly or quarterly profit distributions that happen at the practice level that obviously impact the lifestyle of that physician in terms of their ability to support themselves and their family.
Can that misalign incentives between practices though? If people are if they share in the profit of at the practice level, but not at the parent company level, that makes one practice want to go in one direction and another in a different?
We don't see that. No, I mean we have both. So we have scenarios where physicians are ownership at the parent company level, but in all cases, physicians are either owners at the practice level or are on their way to be owners at the practice level, because that's where they can see the impact of the profit distributions. And obviously that profitability at the local level impacts the profitability at the parent company level. So that's where the alignment of incentives happens between the practices and the parent.
I've asked you quite a lot about the different schema that can be used for compensation. What haven't I asked you? Actually, before I ask you that question, are there any examples that you think of that you're comfortable sharing of, hey, that was a mistake we made earlier on, that we did something and it misaligned what we wanted? Is there any example like that you'd share?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think I don't know about you or your listeners, but I always learn a whole lot more from the things I do wrong than from the things I do right.
Because it hurts.
Yeah. And I think, going back to an earlier comment I made, we have certainly in our past created compensation models and structures that we thought drove alignment of our interests through complicated variable compensation structures. Complicated sliding scales of percentages, complicated thresholds of hurdles, separating revenue associated with certain services from others, complicated KPI models, and it always breeds a certain level of are you playing with the numbers? Are you gaming the system? Are you and it creates a level of mental gymnastics that is brain damage for both us at Inception, and then also for our physician partners, that it's just it was unnecessary, and and we created a scenario one time where we segmented the ownership of the business into the physicians and Inception, and those physicians all shared in the profitability of the business after the compensation of the physicians. Using this as an example, a second example of things we did wrong. And what it ended up doing as an unintended consequences is it made those physicians unincentivized to hire new doctors, because those new doctors would only impact their side of the profitability, and that just made no sense. And that's why we've gotten to a place where we're real big on there's no classes of ownership. While certain states might say we've got to create to call them separate things because one's a physician and one's not. We don't get money. Inception doesn't get $1 and the doctors get $2. We all share in $1, and we all share in it the same exact way. And it just creates a scenario where there's a level of transparency and a level of trust that's developed from that I think we in certain instances frankly screwed up at various times in the past. That in combination with screwing up the variable comp structures through various overly complicated models that I think, again, when it gets so complicated that everyone's got to get an Excel spreadsheet out to understand it, it just creates a scenario where you just naturally breed mistrust, and that's not what we want.
Well, you've certainly answered the original question from the doctor who wanted us to cover this topic. I'm going to let you conclude. How should we conclude about compensation models for fertility doctors?
I would tell you that I think it's important for everybody to realize there's not one right or wrong answer. That the individual dynamics of a specific practice might drive there might be really good reasons why something's been done that way, and certainly if you've got a physician who's evaluating a job, I think oftentimes asking the why question, like, why do you do it this way? And why, if I take this job over here, is the structure different than the job over here? I think it's really important because I think in most cases, I think there'll be a really good explanation for why, and it'll make sense, and it'll give you the sense of confidence in making that decision. And I think whether it be like I said, the geography or the size of the practice or the individual culture of that individual practice, it's really important to find the right answer for that right practice, not hey, there is one right answer for all practices.
TJ Farnsworth, it's always a pleasure having you back on. I look forward to having you again. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Griffin.
You've been listening to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast with Griffin Jones. If you are ready to take action to make sure that your practice thrives beyond the revolutionary changes that are happening in our field and in society, visit fertilitybridge.com to begin the first piece of the fertility marketing system, the goal and competitive diagnostic. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.